Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. It's lockdown 5.0 here in Melbourne, which has meant I've had plenty of time to catch up on everything. But after 6 months of owning both the A7S III and FX6, I've been very keen to properly test the ISO response of these cameras and the noise they produce. And in this video, I want to go through what I've found and my recommendations if you find yourself shooting with these cameras. Firstly, let's start with the reason I'm clumping these cameras together, which is mainly because they use a nearly identical full-frame sensor design. Similar physical size, same megapixels, and same amazing low light capabilities. Sony claims the A7S III doesn't share the same dual base ISO design as the FX6's sensor, however there are still many consistencies which we'll talk about in this video. The main advantages to the FX6 is the ability to record 4K DCI, and importantly turn off noise reduction, to which the latter is more important than it sounds in this context. Now, talking from experience, most of my professional jobs are on the FX6, usually in environments where I can properly bring in lights and ensure the ISO value is set to the base of 800. The A7S acts as a B camera for some shoots, but a lot of the time I'm just using it for personal projects like a recent travel vlog I shot in Tasmania, so the ISO values aren't as important. However, I think it's critical to know how your camera is going to respond in different lighting situations and the right limits to impose on your image. Yes, both of these cameras are amazing in low light, and for certain types of projects, this is really going to come in handy. But remember, higher ISOs are always going to introduce more noise, and while it's a good to have option, for a lot of what I do, it's honestly more of a nice to have. So let's get to some of these takeaways and buckle up because it is about to get a little bit technical.
So Neil, you're telling me I can save 25% off life insurance? That's insane. Yeah, thanks so much for your call, Neil. I really appreciate it, mate.
Starting with the A7S III, this is a prime example of how a dual base ISO design might catch you off guard. I noticed when I first started using the camera, I got some quick test shots using the auto ISO setting. Very quickly I started to see how noisy the image was, especially in ISOs north of 3200. To add to this, as the ISO increases in the auto mode, the artifacts and noise change significantly, so it's almost impossible to effectively apply noise reduction and recover the image. By ISO 10,000, the image is full of noise and color artifacting, and in my opinion, totally unusable. However, once we get to ISO 12,800, the noise floor cleans up significantly. Just for clarity here, a dual base ISO would be considered a sensor design where two different circuits on the sensor pick up light at different sensitivities. When done well, both base ISOs should have the same dynamic range as one another. While I can't run these tests myself, CineD have done some lab tests and found that between ISO 640, which is this camera's native ISO, and ISO 12,800, the dynamic range is very close, around 12.5 stops, which most people would identify as a dual base ISO design. But apparently not according to Sony. What I found in my testing is ISO 3200 is the absolute highest I would go before the noise in the image starts to get excessive. Even then, 1600 would be preferable if you need a little more gain but want to keep the image as clean as possible. Beyond this, you'll want to switch over to ISO 12,800, which will give you a much cleaner noise floor, and of course for such a high ISO value, this is really impressive, and where this camera earns its title of low light king. And finally, if you're using the auto ISO mode, which may be useful in more of a vlogging type project, make sure to set your maximum to less than 3200 to save yourself from all that noise. CineD have also pointed out how the internal noise reduction of the A7S III does give the image a cleaner noise floor, but at the expense of a more natural looking one. Especially in the high ISO ranges, details begin to get a bit muddy. Philip Bloom has done some of his own tests using the ProRes RAW output on the A7S III, which bypasses the internal noise reduction, and he found that thankfully those details could be recovered. But sadly, this doesn't increase the dynamic range of the image, making it a much larger file for not much more benefit. Still, if you find yourself shooting at those high ISO values, ProRes RAW recording using something like an Atomos Ninja 5 might give you some more natural results. Moving on to the FX6, my preferred way of shooting with this camera is to keep it in Cine EI or S-Log3 and keep the noise reduction turned off. This has proven to work really well for me because it gives me the most control of my image. And because I'm mainly shooting at the base 800 ISO setting, it's usually fairly clean and the noise that is present feels more organic. My testing showed some different results on the FX6 due to the real dual base ISO configuration. First of all, you could only go to ISO 3200 on the base 800 setting, and on the base 12800, you can go as low as ISO 3200. So starting with the base 800 setting, the noise performance did worsen on its way to ISO 3200, obviously. With the lack of in-camera noise reduction, it again felt more natural compared to the A7S III, which can start to become a bit more blotchy and lack detail. The base 12800 setting meant that when you're using the lower ISO values from 3200, all we're really doing is lowering the ceiling of the image being captured. This means if your image was overexposed to ISO 12800, bringing down your ISO value won't stop it from clipping. It's just taking those clipped highlights and bringing down the overall exposure of the image. There's no benefit in the noise of the image between ISO 3200 and ISO 12800 in this setting. However, once we hit 16,000, we of course saw the noise floor start to increase as expected, but it was still very usable. My recommendation here is beyond ISO 1600, you're best to jump to ISO 12800, same as on the A7S III. On the FX6 though, this is more feasible because you have an internal ND filter, which will allow you to modulate the exposure of the image more easily than on the A7S III, especially if you're trying to keep the same aperture and shutter speed. Lastly, before I wrap this video up, remember a lot of what I've talked about here applies to most cameras. ISO is an arbitrary concept, and the base ISO of any camera is what the manufacturers deem to get you the most amount of dynamic range in the highlights and shadows. Changing this down just decreases the ceiling of the image, and adjusting it up just increases the noise floor, often making the noise more visible, as well as the shadows of the image. Effectively, all you're doing is adjusting the exposure of your image at the expense of your dynamic range. As Alistair Chapman over at XDCam likes to point out, changing the ISO is not changing the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. It's merely changing the gain of the image. And if you'd like to know more, I definitely recommend you read some of his great articles, which I'll link down below. Knowing the limits around what ISO values you can safely shoot is really important, especially when you're out there running and gunning. If you have the time and resources though, definitely set up lights and attempt to shoot as close as possible to your base ISO. Your computer and less time applying noise reduction later will thank you for it. If this video has taught you something, make sure to hit that like button, and of course, hit subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Stay well everyone, and I'll see you in the next video. Hopefully, when I can legally leave my house again. All right, bit of an impromptu unboxing of a lens that literally just arrived after I filmed this video. Ideally, I would have liked to have filmed with this lens. I've been waiting for it for over a month now, so keen to actually see it. I'm gonna try and show you without hurting myself. It's actually tiny. Yeah, it's the Sony 35mm f1.8. The quality sticker's starting to come off already, which is interesting. Hopefully, it's not indicative of the quality of this lens. Yeah, this thing's tiny. It's just like the smallest lens box I think I've ever seen in my life. Is that the lens hood or is that the whole lens? No, I think it's all together. The lens hood is on it. This thing is tiny. A really small lens. Actually, of course, before I end this, I had to do this. This is the 35mm f1.8. It's a tiny lens. I had the 24-105 on before at f4. This is now the 35 f1.8 at f1.8, I'm pretty sure. Yep, f1.8. Had to put the ND filter on to 1/7. It's just on auto, so it's just perfectly exposing this. Feel free to let me know in the comments below what you think of this lens and the f1.8. I might end up rocking this a little bit more. Maybe not at f1.8. I feel like it's a bit intense, but maybe like f2.8. And thank you for joining me for this impromptu unboxing right at the end of a very unrelated video.